Second Punic War only starts a generation or so later in 218. What's the cause of this war? This guy, Hannibal, who was a Carthaginian prince, the son of Hamilcar Barcas, who was living in Spain at the time, decided to invade Rome in revenge for what the Romans had done to them during the First Punic War. And this is what he does. In 218, after invading a Roman-allied Saguntum, he takes his army, which included, at that point, about 70,000 soldiers, many of them allies of Gauls, Spaniards, Numidians, and Carthaginians, over the Pyrenees, and over the Alps, down into the Italian peninsula, at a time of the year when the Romans never would have expected. He goes through the Alps in the winter. And he does this in this crazy way. He does it with war elephants. What are war elephants? War elephants are elephants that have been domesticated. And by the way, the only elephants that have been domesticated are Indian elephants. And trained to fight. And brought these elephants over the Alps into Italy. How many elephants did he start out with? Over 100. But only about 14 made it over the Alps, apparently. And here we can see a war elephant in action. But it would be a fearsome thing. And for the Romans, this was terrifying because they had not encountered elephants in battle before, at least not during that generation. And the elephants they fought against scared their horses and made them run away. Hannibal stayed in Italy, smashed Roman army after Roman army in a series of decisive battles. The most notable of which is the one called the Battle of Cannae, which happens in 215 BCE in southern Italy, right here. Let's talk a little bit more about that. In this battle, Hannibal's army, which is much smaller at this point, probably not much bigger than 35,000, squares off against Roman forces, fighting in typical Roman triplex acies formation. That's where you have 3 battle lines. At the beginning of the battle, the smaller Carthaginian army lines up, and as soon as the Roman army advances, the Carthaginian army seems to retreat by going this way. At the same time, the Roman cavalry tries to fight the Numidian cavalry that fought for the Carthaginians, but they fled backwards, luring the Roman cavalry away. Something similar happened over here on this side as well. The second phase of the battle, what happens is this. The Roman battle lines get so far into the Carthaginian battle lines that the Carthaginians are able to come around their sides and flank them. And once this happened, the Carthaginians were able to sweep through the sides of the Roman battle lines, mowing them down. Most of the Roman army, which was well over 50,000, was wiped out in just a few hours. And this was a terrifying event for the Romans. Here is a famous Italian sculpture of a victorious Hannibal playing with the signet rings of all the Roman senators who died in this battle. Why was this so scary for the Romans? Well, they lost most of their army in one battle. Also, Hannibal wasn't really that far away from the city of Rome. At this point, he could have besieged Rome and snuffed out the city. Unlike the First Punic War, where the two combatants didn't actually pose an existential threat to each other. That is, the Carthaginians weren't trying to wipe out the Romans weren't trying to wipe out the Carthaginians. In the Second Punic War, it could be said that Hannibal was trying to snuff Rome off the face of the earth. And it looked like he might be able to do it. Well, this was the last major engagement on Italian soil during this time. And Hannibal would spend a lot of the rest of the war trapped in southern Italy, trashing things down there. And in fact, there are some historians who go so far as to say is the damage that Hannibal did to southern Italy during this time, consequently forced farmers off their land, has impacted the economy of that part of Italy even to this day, which is somewhat more economically depressed than the top part of Italy over here. Ultimately, however, the Romans wisely took the offensive to North Africa and invaded Carthage. In the Battle of Zama, Hannibal's army is defeated decisively, not so much by his own fault, but because of lack of real planning. He had a large army that easily would have been enough to defeat the Romans, but he didn't have enough time to plan or coordinate or drill with this army, and he was beaten in this battle. However, Hannibal survives and ends up traveling to Asia Minor, where he lives out a lot of the rest of his days at the court of various Hellenistic kings. He'll die by suicide in 183 BCE. What are your takeaways from this? 1. Hannibal is terrifying for the Romans. He trashes their backyard and can't be beaten for well over a decade. And he was brutal in his tactics and was good at hiding from the Romans. And when he met them in the open, he was never defeated except for once. For the Romans, Hannibal was like the devil and the boogeyman all rolled into one. For generations after this, when a Roman mother wanted to get her son or daughter to behave, if he or she was acting up, she would say, "Shh, Hannibal ad portas." What does that mean? It means Hannibal is at the gates. There's nothing scarier a Roman mother could think to say to her child than this. Your takeaway should be that if in the first war the Romans trusted their safety to the state, the same is true in the second one. Losing tens of thousands of men in one day, the Romans found a way to defeat Hannibal by raising more and more troops. They could not be beaten because they wouldn't give up on their own homeland. This war would have profound impacts on the way the Romans approached defense and their own empire, though. We'll talk about that in a minute. At the end of this war, Carthage was reduced to little more than a city-state, and Rome's general, Publius Cornelius Scipio, got the name Africanus for having defeated an African state. This will take us to the Third Punic War, which actually goes on sometime later. At this point, Carthage is still a city-state, but is doing better on trade and has actually bounced back in a lot of ways. However, not every Roman was pleased to see this. Cato the Censor, a famous author of De Agricultura, a Roman guidebook to farming, would finish every single speech in the Senate with the following saying, "Carthago delende est." What does that mean? It means Carthage must be destroyed. So whether Cato was talking about a land reform or the sewer system, he would finish his speech up with, "Carthage must be destroyed." Eventually it worked. In 149 BCE, the Roman army went to war with Carthage, the goal being to wipe Carthage off the face of the earth. And they were successful in doing this. Carthage was destroyed, Africa was reduced to a province. Cato the Elder never lived to see the end of this war. He only agitated to see it happen because he was a veteran of the Second Punic War and had an instinctive hatred for the Carthaginians. The main general for this was Scipio Aemilianus, a relative of Scipio Africanus from the Second Punic War. And this war will have consequences for the way Rome approaches its empire. Your takeaway from the First Punic War is that the Romans had boundless love for their state and would do anything to save it. And much is true for the Second Punic War. The takeaway from the Third Punic War is this. The Romans, in fighting the First and Second Punic Wars, had acquired foreign provinces. Here, and here in Spain, and now in Macedonia as well. And the Romans were fighting defensive wars to keep themselves safe. But in so doing, they had spread out quite a ways. And this will have other impacts too. The Rome of the First Punic War was no longer the same as the Rome of the Third Punic War. If the Rome of the First Punic War got involved in a proxy squabble in Sicily and unwittingly acquired new provinces, the Rome of the Third Punic War was unwilling to have enemies in its backyard. That should be your takeaway from the Third Punic War. The Romans had fundamentally changed in some way, and they'd also acquired along the way an empire. They didn't want to acquire this empire, but once they started acquiring empire through defensive wars, it was hard to stop. This is what Rome looks like in the 200s. By the end of the Third Punic War, Rome will have possessions in Spain all the way out to Asia as a result of defensive wars abroad. If they didn't want to acquire an empire, they had certainly done a bad job at avoiding it. And if keeping yourself safe by having no enemies is the way you acquire an empire, it can be a dangerous path. Stay tuned for my next lectures on Caesar and Mithridates.